The snow came down in silence. Not gentle, but suffocating. The kind of silence that pressed against eardrums and made the world feel smaller with each breath. Sarah McKenzie stumbled through drifts that reached past her knees, each step a negotiation between forward motion and collapse. Her left eye had swollen shut hours ago. Blood from the gash above her temple had frozen into dark crust along her cheekbone. The copper taste of it lingered in her mouth where her lip had split. She no longer felt the cold in her fingers. That worried her less than it should have. Behind her, somewhere in the white darkness, her husband was hunting. She knew this the way prey knows when it is being tracked. Not through sound or sight, but through the particular electricity that runs through a body when survival becomes the only thought that matters. She had left him bleeding on the cabin floor, the cast iron skillet still warm in her hand when she ran. Whether he was dead or merely wounded, she didn't know. What she knew was that if he found her before she found shelter, the question would become irrelevant to her future. The plains stretched endlessly in every direction, unmarked and unforgiving. A vast white emptiness that swallowed footprints in a race direction. Her boots, thin-soled and meant for indoor work, for sweeping floors and kneading bread, had soaked through in the first mile. Her cotton dress, the blue one she had worn to make breakfast that morning before everything shattered, clung to her legs in frozen folds. No coat, no gloves, no plan beyond putting distance between herself and the man who had promised before God and witnesses to love and cherish her, and had spent 3 years teaching her what those words meant to him in the language of bruises and silence. She crested a low rise and saw smoke, thin and gray, rising like prayer from a cluster of lodges in a shallow valley below. Teepees. The word came to her through the fog of exhaustion and cold. Her heart, already laboring in her chest, seized with a new kind of fear. She had heard the stories every settler heard, whispered in parlors and repeated at church socials. Warnings delivered in lowered voices over Sunday dinners. Tales of violence and captivity, of women who vanished into the wilderness and came back changed in ways that could not be spoken of in polite company. But Sarah McKenzie was long past polite company. She was past fear of the theoretical. The man hunting her through this storm was real and close and absolutely certain in his belief that she belonged to him the way a horse belongs to its owner. Halfway down the slope, her legs gave out. She fell forward into snow and did not get up. The cold wrapped around her. Somewhere far away, voices. Lakota voices, though she had never heard the language. The sound was different from English, sharper in places, rounder in others. Then darkness. When she woke, warmth. Not the aggressive heat of a roaring fire, but the steady, intentional warmth of carefully tended coals. She was lying on something impossibly soft after days of frozen ground. Furs, she realized. Buffalo hide beneath her, thick and dark, and elk hide covering her, lighter colored and worked soft as cloth. The air was heavy with the smell of sage and wood smoke and something medicinal she couldn't name, something earthy and ancient. She opened her one good eye. A woman sat across from her in the half-light, old enough that her face had folded into deep lines that spoke of decades lived beneath an open sky. Her hair, gray and long, hung in a single braid over her shoulder. She was working on something with her hands, beadwork in colors of red and white and deep blue, her fingers moving with the unhurried precision of someone who has done the same task 10,000 times and will do it 10,000 more. The woman looked up. Their eyes met. Sarah tried to sit. Pain lanced through her ribs. The woman spoke in Lakota, voice low and firm. Sarah didn't understand words, but meaning was clear. Stay down. The woman moved closer, pressed one hand to Sarah's forehead, the other to her own chest. Mato Sapa. A name. Sarah tried to speak, but her throat was too dry. Mato Sapa lifted a wooden cup to her lips. Water, cool and clean. Outside, voices rose and fell. Not angry, but deliberating. Mato Sapa stood and pulled back the hide flap. A young man's voice answered, sharp and skeptical. Mato Sapa's response was sharper, authoritative, the kind that ends conversations. The voices quieted. Sarah learned through observation. The camp was Lakota, Matosapa was someone of importance. People deferred to her. Sarah's presence was a complication. Men came to the teepee speaking in tones from curious to quietly furious. Each time, the old woman would gesture to Sarah and say something brief. Each visitor would leave, and Matosapa would return to her beadwork. On the third day, Sarah could sit up. On the fourth, she could stand. Matosapa brought food, dried meat, boiled root vegetable, thick soup tasting of wild onions. Sarah ate slowly, aware of being watched. Children stared openly. Women glanced and looked away. Men did not look at all, which felt more deliberate. On the fifth day, her husband came. She heard him before she saw him. His voice, loud and entitled and familiar, in a way that made her stomach clench, cutting through the morning air like something sharp dragged across tin. He was speaking English, the words carrying across the camp with the assumption of authority. He wanted his property back, his wife, his lawful possession. He had brought 3 other men with him, their horses stamping and blowing in the cold. Ranchers from nearby homesteads, she guessed from their dress. Men who understood the arithmetic of frontier justice and had decided that retrieving a runaway wife fell well within acceptable parameters of neighborly assistance. The camp did not panic. That was the first thing that struck Sarah, watching from the teepee entrance. No one ran, no one screamed. Instead, there was a kind of organized stillness, a coordinated response that spoke of a people who had faced armed strangers before and survived by thinking clearly. Men moved with purpose toward the edge of the camp, where 4 white men sat on horseback, waiting with the patience of those who believed the outcome inevitable. Women gathered children without hurry, moving them behind lodges. Elders emerged from their teepees, faces impassive, and at the center of it all, walking with the unhurried confidence of someone who has never in his life doubted his authority to exist in this place, came a man Sarah had not seen before. He was perhaps 50 winters, with a face that looked like it had been carved from the same ancient stone as the Black Hills themselves. His hair, streaked with gray like frost on dark water, hung loose past his shoulders. He wore a shirt decorated with intricate quill work and a bear-clawed necklace that spoke of hunts survived and honors earned through decades of living deliberately in a landscape that did not forgive weakness. When he stopped in front of the 4 mounted men, the entire camp seemed to exhale, a collective breath held and then released. Her husband saw her then. Standing at Matosapa's teepee entrance, one hand braced against the frame, face still marked with bruises turned yellow-green. He smiled, not with joy, but grim satisfaction. "Sarah," he called, "time to come home." She said nothing, throat closed around words. The Lakota man looked from Sarah to her husband and back, then spoke in Lakota, voice pitched to carry. Matosapa appeared beside Sarah, translating through gestures. But Sarah understood anyway. The man was asking a question. Simple question, a complicated answer. Did she want to go back? Sarah looked at her husband, at the men flanking him, at the camp surrounding her, at Matosapa's hand resting lightly on her shoulder. She thought about the cabin, the sound of her own breathing in darkness, the careful way she had learned to move through rooms, to speak, to exist in space belonging to someone else. The skillet in her hand, the weight of it, how it had connected with bone. She shook her head. Her husband's face changed. Smile vanished, replaced by something colder. He started to dismount. The Lakota man raised one hand, gesture so small it barely qualified as movement. And 30 warriors materialized from positions Sarah hadn't realized they'd been holding. Not threatening, just present, just visible, just enough. The chief spoke in broken English. "Woman choose. You go." Her husband looked at warriors, at camp, at numbers. He was a man who understood arithmetic. Slowly he swung back into his saddle. "This isn't over, Sarah." Then he and his men turned horses north, back towards scattered homesteads and fragile civilization. The silence that followed was different from any Sarah had known. Not silence of fear or submission, silence of decision made and accepted. The chief turned to her. He spoke in Lakota, and Matosapa translated in meaning. Sarah was being given choice. She could leave, walk to nearest fort, find her way back, or stay. If she stayed, she would be under tribal protection. But protection was not acceptance. She would have to earn her place, learn the language, learn the ways, become something other than what she had been. Sarah looked at the chief, at Mato Sapa, at the camp that had sheltered her when she had nowhere else. She thought about the woman she had been that morning in the cabin, making breakfast with shaking hands, the woman she might become. "I stay," she said. The years that followed were not easy. She learned Lakota slowly, one word at a time, through pantomime and patient repetition from Mato Sapa and children who found her accent hilarious. She learned to tan hides, gather roots, read weather and animal behavior. She learned the stories not as myths but as history, connective tissue holding a people together across generations. Slowly, she stopped being the white woman who had fled and became Sarah Mato, named for the woman who found her in snow. When Mato Sapa died 10 years after that first winter, Sarah held the old woman's hand and sang the death song she had been taught, pronunciation still imperfect, but intention clear. The tribe buried Mato Sapa in traditional way, and Sarah wept with grief absolute and uncomplicated by anything except love. She never saw her husband again. She heard years later that he had remarried, moved east to Nebraska or Kansas. The news arrived like a letter meant for someone else. It had nothing to do with her. She was Sarah Mato now, keeper of stories, teacher of children, the woman who had chosen the snow over the fire and found in that choice a life worth living.